Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Make sure you look at these slideshows for yourself. I'm just going to highlight a few things because in the next demonstration speech, we'll be creating an outline. And in this also, you'll look at patterns of organization. Most of your organization will be similar in a demonstration speech, connective statements, and outlines. Speaking outlines are much different than just the type of outlines that you're used to writing in class for a written paper. So there are a number of ideas that we can keep in our mind at once. 7 plus or minus 2. 3 to 5. Sometimes that's why we chunk numbers and things when we speak numbers. Categories of information should be distinct, different, and clear. And organizing has 3 steps: groups, labels, and ordering. So grouping is patterns and connections of data. You don't want 15 to 20 points in a speech. That's just too much. So we chunk things together in 5 or fewer numbers or main groups. That helps people to understand. Even in visual, you want to make sure you're chunking information. This also helps gain credibility and helps your audience retain information. Chunking is super important, and your teachers do this all the time when they're teaching. This also helps people to remember things. And you want to be careful that topics aren't too big or too teeny tiny so that they don't meet the criteria. Most of the time, our demonstration or our speeches are in chronological order, and in spatial order, not as much, but mostly chronological order. Chronological is in time order. It's a process to explain or to instruct. And so when you do a demonstration speech, it might be in a process, but not always in time, but sometimes. Spatial is where things are located, if it's a spatial type of speech. Not as much for our demonstration speech would it be spatial. Must be logical. Part to whole is like a piece of something to the whole, and that's another type of organization in a speech or a paper. Problem solution, of course, is in persuasion. Problem and cause solution. Monroe's motivated sequence, we'll talk about that later. Generally more logical than providing solution first, then discussing the problem. So you don't usually say the solution first. First you say the problem. Other organization principles may be that you use organizational patterns, one main point and then subpoints. Sometimes you go least to greatest or greatest to least, depending on what you want to stick in a person's mind. Labeling, you use full sentences, utilize parallelism if it fits, like how things fit together side by side. Do not write as vague directions to yourself. Your instructor or others should understand your points. When you connect one idea to the next, parts of the speech, such as an intro to a conclusion, and connectives come after the body is composed, you usually go in and add those later. They're phrases that connect one part to the next and show a relationship. One connective would be as you can see, first comma, next comma, lastly. That would be in chronological order. They provide functions. It helps us know where we're at, keeping track of our attention. It's logical. So when you have a main point, then you have a transition. You have another main point, then you create a transition. So it's a bridging statement from one idea to the next. Internal summaries, where you summarize things. You might preview to tell us what's coming up or what's next. You may use transition words like, for example, and an or even transition words. Signposts would be things that signify that you're having a statement, or a bridging statement is kind of like a transition, but it's usually a phrase. When you are using connectives, they are for connecting. It's not a bunch of evidence. In a speech, they might be a sentence or two, not just a word or two, depending on what type they are. Don't leave to ad-lib, like just to make them up for yourself. Make sure that you put them in there so that you know that you need to say them. Vary them, don't use the same every time. Sometimes you need to connect between subpoints. Then you're going to create an outline. I gave you an example of an outline along with the speech for the demo speech, and you're going to use that as your blueprint. It's not your speech per se, it's your plan. There's a preparation outline, which is like a blueprint, and a speaking outline, which you use note cards. So you're not going to be using a big piece of paper to speak from, but that's your preparation outline that you're going to actually hand in for points before your speech. But you're also going to have a speaking outline where you have note cards, larger font, and directions for what you want to say in your delivery. So that would be items from your outline that you'll be speaking from. So that was chapter 6 notes. Chapter 7, on the other hand, is more about supporting materials, perception, attention, and supporting materials. So supporting materials are necessary. They help clarify and prove different things for argument. And you want to make sure that you use lots of different supporting materials when it's necessary. It might be examples, narratives, definitions, descriptions. So that's not always something visual that you're showing. It might be how it's stated, historic and scientific fact, as well as statistics. That helps back up and gives people ideas of what you're talking about, gives them a reference point. Narratives, it's like a story, to tell a story. An anecdote is a little story. A historical story is, obviously something that happened in history. And a hypothetical story where you say, imagine that, and that's a hypothetical story for narratives. Define means to set limits or boundaries. Specialized terms or acronyms, which are jargon. Sometimes you have to define jargon or acronyms for people if they don't know the topic very well. Use stipulated definitions. Defined by classification or differentiation. So you're putting things into groups. It might be by examples or operational. If you're in a factory or a facility, you can define it by operations or compare, contrast, or negation. Descriptions. So using vocab that gives specifics, imagery, use all of your senses when describing. Obviously, facts are always helpful, historical, scientific, observations. Make sure you use citations. Statistics are a good source of information. Terminology is different ideas that relate to specific jobs and clarifying those. Mean, median, and mode, and standard deviation are all terms that you should be aware of. Other statistics, testimonies. Sometimes you have experts in a field and you have a testimony that helps support your information. Sometimes you have different perceptions and supporting materials that you'll use. And again, paying attention is important, as well as qualities of attention. So these would be all qualities or factors of attention. Making sure your conclusion has supporting materials that answer the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Lots of supporting material as needed, and don't just depend upon one. So those are all slideshows that I also shared with you in the Distance Learn folder, the blue folder for 412 to 416, and those go over chapters 6 and 7. I will talk specifically about the next speech on my next video here on the demonstration speech, in particular looking at the scoring rubric as well as the outline. So email me if you have questions about chapters 6 and 7. Like I said, you have the slideshows there. Just wanted to reiterate some of those main points.